In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Patrick Kennedy is the executive director of the Long Beach Interfaith Community Organization. He's been the executive director since 2000. He's been a community organizer since 1978. And today on our program, we're going to talk about 4 propositions that will be coming up on the November ballot. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
We are going to have a casual conversation. I know you are out there wondering what's going on with all these propositions. And we're grappling just like everybody else, Patrick, in terms of what do these propositions mean? I want to take a position on it, but when we go in that ballot box, that behind that curtain, it gets a little confusing. And even the language in some of the things that they send voters is a bit confusing. And I'm a college-educated person, and I get a little confused. But today, Patrick, we're going to talk about 4 propositions. Proposition 5, which talks about, which would change the requirements for certain property owners to transfer their property to tax-based replacement property. We're going to talk about that. And then Proposition 10 would expand local government authority to enact rent control on residential property. We're going to talk about that one. We're going to talk about Proposition 11, which requires private sector emergency ambulance employees to remain on call during work breaks. That's a very, very important. And then we're going to talk about the, what do they call it, the dialysis issue on one of the propositions. Now, you have been involved with organizing since 1978. You've been the executive director for Interfaith organization since 2000. But you're actively, as you have been for many years, involved with the propositions. And we've decided today we're going to deal with these 4 propositions. So let's talk about Proposition 5. Anyway, before we get to your position, tell us what Proposition 5 is all about.
It's something that was presented by the real estate industry that says that if you're over 55, you're severely disabled, or a victim of a natural catastrophe, there's a benefit for you to be able to, when you sell your home, you could take the tax advantage from Prop 13 along with you.
Okay.
And so it's basically for a group of people, 55, primarily 55 and older, it gives them a way to reduce their property taxes when they move.
What's wrong with that?
I think in a perfect world, yeah, wouldn't it be great if we would keep property taxes low for everybody and let everybody do a homeowner? The big concern around it, first and foremost, is somebody ends up paying the cost on the reduced property taxes.
Who would wind up paying the cost on the reduced tax?
It would be the schools and the cities and the counties. And so the property tax is divided between the schools and the local government. And the estimate is it would be, about $125 million the first year, but grow to about $1 billion a year each year as more and more people use this. And so it would be $1 billion less for schools and $1 billion less for the counties and the cities.
Now, that's a big chunk of money, and when we consider the underperforming schools in Los Angeles County alone, to take money from them, but I hesitate to say that a little bit because digressing a little bit, as we said in the green room, when they instituted the lotteries several years ago, they said that would really help the schools because people will be buying lottery tickets and most of that money would go to improve schools. It didn't appear like that happened.
And people have been frustrated with that. I can't tell you how many times when we're talking about schools and funding for schools, saying, what about the lottery? What about the lottery? Because you hear these big numbers. But when you figure out what's the profit on it, and they split the profit, and And when it's split between all of the schools, it ends
It's
up
not
being a
very little.
very modest amount of money going to local schools.
So on this Proposition 5, if they allow people to say, I want to transfer my property taxes to a different property, if this proposition goes through, then there will be less money for the schools. Most people probably, in my estimation, most people would not be for that. Am I wrong?
I think the polling would support you on that. I think that most people are seeing it and saying why. In particular, what doesn't make sense on this is there's already something for property owners over 55 that if you're moving, you're saying, okay, the kids have moved out, I have a home.
Empty nest.
I don't need 5 bedrooms, I don't need 4 bedrooms, we just need a little place for the couple. You could downsize or buy something the same value and be able to take your property tax break along.
You can
with
do that now.
You can do that
now.
now.
That bill, that law is the Casa.
No, it's the. It was a few years back, and we could probably look it up. But it was, I think it was in the '80s that they passed that.
All right.
And it was protecting. It was to protect people when they said, I don't want to be stuck for the rest of my life in this house. Can I move to something smaller?
Okay.
So there's an option to do it. The limitations is you only could do it once.
Okay.
And you got to do it in the county where you live or with a county in California where there's already an agreement. And so most of the Southern California counties have agreements to pass those tax breaks back and forth when people do that. This would expand that, but I guess the thing that I think rubs people wrong on this one is if you're trying to upgrade, you're saying, boy, this house is worth a $500,000, but I think I'd like to get something for $750,000 for my retirement.
Sure.
And I get to take along, a formula that gives me less than I would pay normally tax because of my previous place. Why should somebody that's doing well, that's already taken advantage of low property taxes because of Prop 13, and has probably got a pretty good increase in value over the time they've owned the house, why should they get one more break? When there's so many people that are trying to get into a piece of property and the interest rates are high, the property taxes are extremely high.
Especially in Southern California.
Yeah. And so it seems like, once again, we're stacking things for the gray hairs and at the expense of the young generation.
And it seems to me that it'd be a bit unfair, but then, on the other side of that coin, Patrick, why should government tell me how to handle my property? And I think that's the fundamental question in the democracy and in the capitalist system, an overreach by the government. Now, most conservative people would say that. Is there any merit in that?
I think that's a good conversation for us always to be having, because the government's always involved in markets. I mean, we hear the free market, but that's nonsense. Every market has rules. And the rules control how the game is played. And the problem is there's certain people that have a lot of resources that get to shape those rules. And so it's become a lopsided game.
Yes.
And so are we having this debate about how much can government influence? Yeah, how much should they influence? We should always have that conversation. But if we're saying, boy, this is to the benefit of one group to the harm of other groups, maybe we ought to think about maybe we rearrange those rules to make it a balanced playing field for people.
Well, okay, then let's move on to Proposition 10. Proposition 10 would expand local government's authority to enact rent control. That's a bad word here, rent control, on residential property. This would tell property owners what to do with their own property. Again, in Proposition 5. Give us some pros and cons on Proposition 10.
Well, can I give some background on it?
Give some background first, yes.
Okay.
On rent control.
So this is really the focus of this is removing an act called Costa-Hawkins.
That's right.
That was passed by the legislature in 1995.
Okay.
What happened is, and you may remember this, housing was pretty stable in Southern California until the late 70s and going into the 80s. And suddenly it took off because there was this notion of, this isn't just a place where you live, but this is a great place to make money, to speculate. And so a lot of people were jumping from house to house and making, and this is a way to raise money. Who was getting hurt was seniors, and that's why Proposition 13 came along.
How are seniors getting hurt?
Property tax would go up based on the assessed value, not the value they paid for the house.
That's right.
And so as the value was going, that was great for them, but they couldn't afford to pay the property taxes to stay there. So Prop 13 said it only goes up 2% a year, and you'll pay 1% of that in slowly increasing value. So the side effect on Prop 13 is it's really stabilized neighborhoods. People don't move as much because you don't want to jump into something with much higher property taxes. So that's how we protected homeowners. But tenants were saying, what about us? Because rents were shooting up also. Rents back then, when I first got my first apartment with a college roommate, it was $135 a month. And so it was very affordable to live and rent a place. But it started shooting up with the same inflation that was going on, the property values. And so cities enacted rent controls to protect tenants, saying, okay, well, we'll slow down the rate at which your rents can go up. And the notion was that will create more stability.
The local governments did that.
The local governments did this. The landlords and the real estate industry weren't happy about this because that really reduced the value of the property, because it's also connected to what can you bring in each month in terms of rents. So they tried a ballot initiative, and they tried to get the legislature to do something. Nothing happened. And then right after Pete Wilson pushed through the 187, the anti-immigrant initiative on the ballot, the landlords came in and worked with him to get this Costa-Hawkins approved. And so how I see it is, it didn't rule out rent control, but it shackled it to make it much less effective as a tool. So there's three ways that the rent control was restricted with this Costa-Hawkins. The first was if you lived in a single-family home or if you lived in a condo, you weren't covered by rent control. The second was if the house was built in 1994 or after, you wouldn't be included in rent control. And in matter of fact, in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, it would go back to when the rent control was passed in the 70s. So anything built after rent control was instituted, they wouldn't be included. And then the third thing was, if you moved out, then the unit would go back to market rate. So these three things really, really affected the effectiveness of rent control. And so it's really hard to say how well rent control works or doesn't work. I know that this push, or where this is coming from, is people saying, we have people really getting crushed by rents. And you don't have to look very far to find people that have been forced out of their homes. Congregations talk about members moving away because they can't afford to live here anymore. People talk about $200, $300, $400, $500 rent increases. And so people are saying, how can we have a stable environment, if we can't predict what our rent's going to be? And so they're looking for protection, saying, we understand that rents need to go up to cover costs, but it needs to go at a rate that we could manage and that we could kind of stabilize our families. And I think for me, this is the part that I get passionate about this stuff, is there's a lot of economists that will come out and say, rent control doesn't work, but who it doesn't work for is for the rent speculators. People that are looking to make money off flipping properties, they're the ones that are really hurt by rent control. This Prop 10 as a regulation there said landlords have to get a fair return on their property.
And that's reasonable for landlords, wouldn't you say? I mean, you own some property. If you want to sell some property, you want to make a profit.
Well, I think so, and I think we probably would chase out some of the people that aren't interested in being good landlords, that are just looking at trying to hit the lotto, because there are people, and I think it's clear, it's a hard job. to be a landlord, to maintain the property, to get good tenants in there, to do that work, and they should be compensated for it. But the people that are coming in, like the investment groups coming out of New York or wherever, and they're buying up single-family homes, and they're buying up apartment buildings, say, we're going to flip them, we're going to make a quick profit, then we're going to sell them to somebody else. I worry about the side effects on the community.
What type of side effects do you see on the community with that type of transaction?
Well, the story that's told on this is we're going to empty out Manhattan Beach, and all the people from Manhattan Beach are going to come and move into Long Beach, and want to live here because they'll be able to afford the rent, and we'll have a better quality people come in. That's the story that people tell. But the reality is, you see 2 and 3 families. You see overcrowding. People can't afford their own place. You see kids that go to 3 schools in a year because they're the family can't hang on to the rent. You see this growing homeless problem we have. You see people living in not only their cars, but they're buying little motorhomes to try to find a place to stay. So we lose as a community with unstable neighborhoods because you don't know your neighbors. We lose some of the things that attracted us to the neighborhood to begin with. If it's stable, I think there's an opportunity to build safer, better communities.
Now, typically, when you have this type of issue in a democracy and in a capitalist economy, someone has to be the referee. Either it's a judge, either it's the government that has to step in, God forbid, a mediator, but it's got to be legal for both people to agree, to step in and say, okay, let's make this fair. Do we see a middle ground? Is the legislator and the state legislator, really the state legislation, can they be the referee? Can they be fair? Now, they're elected officials, and they're given money in their campaign by people who are very wealthy. Can they be fair?
I don't think it's impossible, but I think their biggest problem is they're too far away from the problem. Mm-hmm. What this tries to do is to get the state out of this business about saying what rent control can be or not, and let a local community make a decision. So passing 10 doesn't create rent control anywhere. What it does is it gives cities a stronger rent control to start looking to negotiate with. And I've heard some interesting things about if this goes into effect, will people not build rental housing because they won't be able to get the returns? And that might be an issue. And maybe there should be some experimentation that's saying, so for 10 years, maybe there's no rent control on a brand new building as you get your equity back. But then as an asset for the community, then let's stabilize it and create.
We're going to take a break right now, Patrick, and we'll come back and continue this discussion on Prop 10, but also Prop 11. And let's talk about voter apathy. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be going to the polls on a national level and on local levels. Very important election, and there has been, I don't know if it continues to exist, a lot of apathy. But we'll be right back with Patrick Kennedy, who is a community organizer and the executive director of the Interfaith Community Organization, talking about the upcoming elections and the upcoming propositions. We'll be right back after these messages. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Welcome back. Patrick Kennedy is our guest today on Conversations with Erroll Parker, and we're talking about propositions. And Mr. Kennedy has been involved in political work, community organizing since 1978, and he's the executive director of the Long Beach Interfaith Community Organization. Patrick, we were talking about Proposition 10 and how somehow somebody's got to be the referee. You got the upper middle class who, of course, wants to make profits. You got the people who are in the lower classes economic-wise, and they see things that they cannot afford. But you got property owners who are just maybe in a solidly middle class, that just want to own some property and so they can have a good retirement. And then you have people who are avaricious and greedy who wants it all. Who in this democracy, in this capitalist economy, is supposed to be the referee? And when we look at Proposition 10, what does that mean to everybody? I mean, what can we do about that? Is there a middle ground on that?
Some of the only referees right now, right, are the courts in an eviction process,
Yes.
and health department or code enforcement at kind of a minimum standards. What Prop 10 does is it says, here's another tool to create another set of referees that would look at, you know, what is an appropriate rent increase, what's an appropriate rent. And I think we have to be careful because we're not looking to have some sort of huge bureaucracy. We want something that's lean.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we have competing interests, and sometimes people forget that making a profit off the property is part of the game. But safe neighborhoods, good places for people to grow up, a sense of community, people that have grown up here their whole life and were able to stay here, all of those are competing values that we need to balance. And I think the challenge, the decision should be made as local as possible. I don't really want somebody in DC or somebody in Sacramento deciding what should happen in Long Beach. But I do want Long Beach people, and not just city council, but people in Long Beach wrestling with this question about what's fair and how do we make it work.
Let's move on to Proposition 11. And that proposition deals with, requires private sector emergency ambulance employees to remain on call during work breaks, eliminate certain employer liabilities. Now, I'm an ambulance guy. I mean, I'm an ambulance driver. I'm entitled to a break. I'm eating my sandwich. I've worked 7 straight hours or 4 straight hours. Aren't I entitled to a break to go off the clock? This proposition says no. You have to be on all the time. It doesn't seem to be that fair.
Well, and it's one of those that, yeah, it's wrestling with these questions that normally we wouldn't wrestle with in terms of workplace conditions. My understanding, the background on this was that there's some legislation or a court case for security guards that said they needed to have their time, you know, they couldn't be on call constantly. And so what that does for the company is, if you have to have people off on break completely, then you have to increase your staffing to cover while they're off.
Well, now when you increase staffing in my company, I'm going to have, that means that's cutting into my profits, and then I'm going to pass that along to the customers. Now it's going to cost you more to take an ambulance.
And the other part that I think plays into this is there's something like this already for firefighters and for police.
Yes.
And so there's a logic. There's a logic to where they're going with this. I personally, you know, we all get into the ballot and we scratch our heads.
Yeah.
And we're saying the only letter or the only editorial I've read against this was from a newspaper that was saying, should we, the public, be deciding this? Shouldn't this be something that takes place in Sacramento between the employers and the employees and the
it would seem
legislature?
That way.
And I get they're trying to do an end run on the negotiation process. Do we oppose it because we don't think this is the right place for this to be done? Or do we weigh in with our best guess? You know, I don't think I've come to a conclusion on this one yet.
Well, when I look at America being a suit-happy country, and if a loved one of mine died because 911 didn't get there in time because the dispatcher could not find a person on duty to come there quick enough. Seconds count when you're talking about that kind of thing. Now, I might give me a good lawyer and say, let's test this. And I think that's what the employers are fretting about. And it's you know, you need Solomon in a case like this.
You know, I get, yeah, and when people read this, they'll also see that there's some mental health work and there's some other additional things to benefit the employees. So I think the companies are trying to say, how do we make this more palatable to people? But we'd like to take care of it it's cheaper for us to take care of this at the ballot box as opposed to in negotiations with the employees. Well, yeah. And I say, for me, I'm not sure which way I'm gonna vote on this one yet, but it's it's an interesting one.
Well, conventional wisdom would say, okay, let's get some, not so much politically savvy people, but let's get some ethical people to come in and let's shape some legislation, shape some policy that will keep the balance in terms of this and looking out for all sides as best as possible. But then that doesn't always mean that is not always the case. Okay.
And just one other
Sure.
point. Had there been a deadline for them to come to a decision, they might have worked something out rather than, spending the money and putting it on the ballot sort of took the deadline away.
Well, all is not lost. I think we'll see how this proposition goes, and of course, if it's passed into law, that is the law, and it's hard to repeal something once it's passed into law. So a judge said we've already gone through this.
That's true.
And so it is what it is. I think the larger question, though, Patrick, and I see it as you see it, is voter apathy. Although I don't think it's going to manifest itself in this election that's coming up next month. This country has been is right now divided as much as it was during the Vietnam War, as much as it was during the Civil War. Last election, we saw a lot of voter apathy. People said, I didn't like Clinton, I certainly don't like Trump because I'm going to sit it out. I don't get the sense that that's the case in this election. Do you? Are you seeing the same thing, Tom?
No, we worked with some churches in Orange County to hold a candidates forum for a congressional race down there. And the church was jammed. I mean, people were there. People wanted to learn, wanted to see the candidates. A lot of energy, and this was, the incumbent had been there for 30 years. So there's a lot of new energy that I've never seen before around candidates. It worries me a little bit in that I think democracy at its best is when people learn how to work as a small group and to solve problems. And I don't think democracy is just let's elect a superhero to take things for us. Because I think most problems are solved. The closer you can get to the problem, the better chance you have at solving them. And we have this superhero culture of, be it an Obama or be it a Trump, they're going to come in with all the answers and change our lives. And the more we do that, the less we control our lives.
There's a responsibility in democracy. You need to be informed, which is the hallmark of my program here. But when you look at the California election, you look at the pamphlet they give you and the language that they use in explaining initiatives and propositions. I'm an educated guy. I went to college, and there are words that they're using, Patrick, that I have to look in a dictionary. And I know that being the educated guy that I am, a lot of people who approach me in terms of the education level, they would not be able to make sense out of this proposition or this initiative.
And it's intentional too, right? I mean,
both
you think
it's intentional?
Well, both sides. I mean, one, and how do you write it to protect themselves from being sued? But both sides are trying to confuse people and kind of lean it. So there's this competitive thing going on that confuses it. But I think it's not just enough to be informed. It's also, do you have people you engage with to talk about this? Because one thing that I've heard about and I'm looking forward to do in my neighborhood is we're going to have a ballot party. We're going to sit down and people are going to talk it through. And it doesn't mean you're going to fill somebody's ballot out for them, but let's hear 3 different opinions on this thing. People feel a whole lot better when they hear 2 or 3 different opinions.
Civic engagement.
And it's one-to-one, people and people's, if it's like sharpening a saw, we're sharpening the saws so that we could cut through the nonsense.
But sometimes when people disagree with you, they take it personal. And in other words, I want to win this argument. And if you disagree with me, and I see the lack of civility even in the halls of Congress.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, or on CNN or any of these other so-called civic engagement, people are shouting at one another. I can't articulate your viewpoint. I just condemn it, and I don't understand it, so I'm going to condemn it. It's who you represent or a buzzword that you say that it just turns me off. And that's pretty dangerous.
That's really one of the more dangerous things of our time, and it's not one side or the other, because it's really a polarized win or lose. We're going to win, you're going to lose. And unfortunately, I know it's a bad word, but democracy is compromise. You know, I mean, any family you're in, you know, unless you have a dictator running it, there's a whole lot of compromise going on.
Do you think the American polity wants a dictator?
It scares me. I mean, never before in my life I've been real worried about the. I watched something about the Roman Empire and Caesar taking over, getting rid of the Senate and taking over as the emperor, because the Senate was incompetent. If our people sent to make decisions can't make decisions, then what's the reaction? The reaction is, let's get somebody to take over and tell us how to do it.
And that's easier. I don't have to think. If I'm being taken care of and I completely trust this person, I'm going to do what he says, and I don't have to engage anyone, and I don't have to be really informed. I trust this person. Now, that's not democracy.
And then we start enslaving ourselves to the decision makers.
The last proposition I wanted to talk about was the one about
the dialysis. Right?
Dialysis one. Yes, thank you so much.
Yes.
Give us a little background on the dialysis deal.
Well, how I understand it is the union working with the workers have been trying to get workers to unionize in the dialysis clinics for a number of years and haven't had much success. They've made a proposal that the total amount of profit that can be made would be 115% of costs plus 15% on top, and that's to cover the overhead and not the overhead, but the management and some of those things. The notion they have is that if they increase the cost, then they can pay their workers better, they could have better clinics, and that we'd have a better context for the dialysis process. The companies are saying, who are you to manage how much we can charge for dialysis? This is our business and we could run it as we want.
Isn't that legitimate?
It gets weird when we get to healthcare, right? What's too much to charge for something? I mean, we got after that guy that was charging so much for wasn't it for AIDS medication?
Yes.
That he was charging enormous amounts. So where's the limit? I believe in the write-up on this, the public, we're paying it through insurance, $150,000 a year for somebody that's in intense dialysis. So enormous amount of public resources is going to this company. And then the question is, what's a fair return on this investment? And so it's going in a new direction on healthcare, saying, should there be different rules for healthcare where the money comes kind of for the common good? Because it's really hard to say no when you're trying to keep a loved one alive, right?
Well, you're under a barrel, yes. I mean, you got to pay out of the pocket, until something else kicks in. If a person is a veteran, maybe, and that's a large bureaucracy. But other than that, who's going to pay? You got to pay as a family. Yeah. And if a person, and you're under a barrel, I mean, they can exploit you if they choose to under the law.
When people were going after the Affordable Care Act, one of the complaints was death panels. They used the language death panels. And yet, I firmly believe they shouldn't be called death panels, but somebody that's neutral has to make a judgment in terms of what's a reasonable standard of care. If you want more than a reasonable standard of care, then you could dig into your own pocket and do it, but what's a reasonable standard? And I don't think I think the doctor should have some input, but I don't think it should be the insurance companies. I don't think it'd be the doctors making money. I don't think it should be the family that's in panic. But it's almost like a grand jury. Somebody needs to figure out what's fair. And I think that's a place where democracy would be very important, that people we trust with good sense can say, does that seem reasonable? Does that not seem reasonable?
We must rely upon, and I think what you're talking about is a matter of morals and ethics. And if a democracy does not have those people who are trained in morality and ethics and can influence policy, then we're doomed.
Well, and especially if to get there to influence policy, you have to rely on donations from the people that are benefiting from how the game's played now. Mm-hmm. It creates this, that we all feel, this sense of an unbalanced playing field. Mm-hmm. And so how, as people, do we start to say, we really need to be able to weigh in on what's fair, and how do we create a fair, and so this is I'm sure people listening are saying, oh, well, here goes Mr. Socialist, but it's always a balance of personal freedom. We got to protect personal freedoms and create opportunities for people to have incentives, but we also have to look at the common good, and that's a really hard thing to look at both of those things. But if we call them names instead of just looking at those two positive things, we aren't making good decisions. But
now we are in a capitalist society,
mm-hmm.
and a capitalist society, those capitalists are after profit, but there's got to be a balance. Patrick Kennedy, it has been so wonderful talking to you about these propositions, about voter apathy, about engagement. I'm hoping that you enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed it, and you out there that are going to go into the ballot box in a couple of weeks, you should want to engage each other on a local level, on an individual level, on a small group level. Talk to those who understand objectively these propositions, know who you're voting for in terms of judges. In this democracy, it takes participation, otherwise we'll lose it. Thank you.
One last thing.
Go run one last thing.
It also takes common sense, and it seems a lot of times that people at the voting box have more common sense than many of our lobbyists and our elected officials.
Without a doubt. Patrick Kennedy, thank you so much for engaging with us in Conversations with Erroll Parker.
My pleasure.
We'll be back next week with some more exciting guests in Conversations with Erroll Parker. Good night. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker.